So it's kind of the rules, if you like, that govern all of those spaces. So now that we have in most places regulated commercial gambling, the kind of quid pro quo of that, if you like, is that there have to be certain observations. And so you have to have a policy on self-exclusion, and you have to have a policy on preventing kids getting into the shops and so on. In particular, what I was speaking about in the conference was the contrast, if you like, between the codes as they're written down, you know, as very formal, abstract ideas, and the lived experience of those shops that they're supposed to govern, if you like. And I think there's quite a contrast there. And I think it's the same actually for lots of gambling spaces, where you have this idea or ideal even of how regulation works in that space. And then you have the practice of it. The codes tend to make responsible the people who are there to serve punters, cashiers or hosts, they're called in other places. And what I was arguing was that from my experience as working as a cashier, you know, the pressures on you are really different. You are there to serve the customer, yes, but you're also there to make money for the company. You're paid in a way that relates to the revenue that's coming through the shop. And at the same time, the codes suggest that you're responsible for the punter's welfare, so that you'll intervene if you think they've got a problem with gambling. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is, you know, that puts you in a very weird position because you want them to spend money in your shop so you can earn more because you're earning really pathetic wages. But at the same time, you might see people in trouble and feel upset about that. At the same time, you might see people who are in trouble and think, actually, I'm too scared to go and intervene because people can get very angry if they're gambling and they aren't in control of their gambling. They're very distinctive spaces. They're really interesting to an anthropologist, but they're not interesting to people like my mum, say. Yeah. They're places that, you know, nice middle-class women would never consider going into. The majority of customers are men, and often working-class men. And they were set up in the 1960s so that people could bet away from the racecourse. And when they set them up, they were supposed to be really unwelcoming. So they didn't want to encourage people to go into them. They just wanted people who were going to have a bet anyway to have somewhere to go to. So they were smelly, smoky, grim, disgusting places. And even when I started my fieldwork before the smoking ban, they were disgusting. I mean, I said in one of my books that, you know, not smoking is frowned upon. It was just the smokiest, smelliest place you've ever been to, with like dogs in there, people bring their dogs in, you know. It was, but at the same time, to me, it was a really interesting place, as I say, because it's part of the local community quite often. The people who go there, often no one's interested in them. And I am. I like hearing their stories. I like asking them about why they bet or what they think about horse racing or, you know, what's important to them. And I think that's a common thing among anthropologists. You know, we take less well-known places perhaps and try and kind of work out what's happening there. Yeah, and sometimes, you know, make what can seem obvious a bit more strange or interesting in some way. So what I spoke about in my talk was how ethics works in practice in betting shops. And in practice, there is a lot of care actually for punters. You know, if people didn't turn up to come to the shop, we would go and check on them, especially if they were very old or frail or had been sick or something like that. You know, my manageress went to people's funerals of punters she'd known very well. So there was a connection, definitely. But as I said in the questions, you know, that's rather fraught because you also know that money moves through those relationships in rather unequal ways. But I think sometimes it was just, you know, a humane sense of being people who have a great deal in common actually, and looking after one another. And it's a contrast to the rules that are very formal and are actually very under-enforced and actually don't bear any relationship to this much deeper but much less easily quantified culture that we find in betting shops. I just wanted to communicate the idea of a different approach to gambling research primarily, and I used my research in betting shops as an example of the different sorts of approaches that we might want to use, because quite a lot of my work is on the production of research, and I did a piece of work called Fair Game where I spoke with a lot of different stakeholders in the field, like researchers, policymakers, treatment providers, and I asked them, what do we need to do in gambling studies? What can we improve? How do we find out about gambling? And what came across was that our field could be stronger. We need greater independence, in my opinion, from industry and industry representatives. We need to be more independent from the profits of gambling, whether that's through the commercial industry or through governments. We need greater academic freedom to write and disseminate our findings, however unpalatable they might be. We need to declare conflicts of interest, so we need to tell people when we're giving talks and when we're writing papers where we got the money from to give that talk or to write that paper, so people can decide for themselves how to interpret it. And I think we need to use a wider range of methods. That's why I showed how I used extended field work to really kind of get beyond the surface of the space that I was interested in and start to think actually about, to use the iceberg analogy, what lies beneath that. It's easy to get an impression of a betting shop if you went in and you spent 5 minutes in there. But if you go to work there, you know what it's like. You think you know something and then you go and work there and you think, wow, this is a completely different experience. Yeah, and then you can try to evoke that imperfectly, because you always know you're going eventually to leave, but you do the best you can, and I think that kind of data is really good for the field, and I'd like to encourage people to spend more time thinking about their methodologies and where their money comes from, to be frank.